They say a courtroom is a place of order, of discipline, of respect. But that morning, something snapped. The courtroom was packed. Civil case number 428. A young black man was suing the city after a wrongful arrest, and sitting on the bench that day was Judge Celeste Monroe, composed, precise, and quietly powerful in her black robe. Everything was going as expected until Officer Valerie Quinn took the stand. A white policewoman in her late 30s, Valerie walked in like she owned the place, chin high, smirk ready. She took the oath, sat down, and the storm began. Judge Monroe calmly asked her to keep her answers clear and concise. Valerie leaned back, crossed her arms, and muttered into the microphone loud enough for everyone to hear. "You people always hide behind the robe and cry racism when you get called out." Gasps, audible, immediate. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Monroe said nothing. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply wrote something down in her notebook. Slowly, silently. It was that kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The kind that holds power, not fear. Sitting near the back, a little black girl tugged her father's sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, why didn't the judge say anything?" He didn't answer. He didn't know how. Because what just happened wasn't just disrespect. It was a declaration, a challenge. One that no one had ever dared throw in Judge Monroe's face until now. And yet, she smiled, just barely, because Judge Monroe knew something Valerie didn't, something that would turn this courtroom upside down. The next 10 minutes felt uncomfortable. Judge Monroe, still seated in calm authority, turned the page in her binder and asked Officer Valerie Quinn a direct question. "Officer Quinn, in your report, you claimed the suspect matched a threat profile. Could you clarify what that means?" Valerie didn't answer right away. She shifted in her chair, leaned into the microphone, and smiled, not politely. "It means I've been on the streets long enough to know danger when I see it, Your Honor." Her voice carried a sharpness just loud enough to sound like confidence, but just smug enough to sting. Then she glanced sideways at the jury and back at Monroe. "I'm not sure how many years you've actually spent outside this air-conditioned courtroom," she added. "But when you're out there, instinct matters." There was a pause, a long, deliberate pause. Even the court clerk looked up. Judge Monroe didn't raise an eyebrow. She didn't even flinch. She simply tilted her head ever so slightly and replied, "So, instinct replaces evidence now." Valerie shrugged. "Sometimes, yes. In the real world, it's not always clean, not always textbook." At that moment, Assistant District Attorney Mark Hensley, a white man in his early 40s, stepped in. "Let's not get too philosophical here," he said, voice clipped. "Officer Quinn is referring to situational awareness, something those of us outside academia tend to rely on." That drew a few quiet chuckles from the back. The jury shifted. One older white juror nodded slightly. It was a coordinated tactic. Monroe knew it. Paint her as detached, the book-smart judge who's never had dirt on her shoes. But Monroe didn't bite. She simply asked for the next page of the report, her voice cool, exact. But it was the way she turned the page that said everything. Slow, measured, like a woman loading her weapon. Valerie, meanwhile, sat back with folded arms, letting the silence linger. Her eyes scanned the jury again. And then she whispered, not into the mic, but loud enough to carry, "This courtroom feels softer than the people we arrest." A few people shifted uncomfortably, and still, Monroe said nothing. That silence again. Not weak, not passive. It was the kind of silence that dares you to fill it and regrets you when you do. And Valerie, she didn't even realize. She'd just stepped deeper into something she couldn't control. Because this wasn't about two women. This wasn't about pride. This was about a system and who it chooses to respect. And today, it just picked the wrong judge to test. The tension didn't break, it deepened. Judge Monroe, still seated in her poised silence, adjusted her glasses and asked Officer Quinn to rephrase her last answer for the record. Just a simple request, a formality. But Valerie didn't take it that way. She let out a sharp breath, exaggerated, then pushed her chair back with the heel of her boot, the metal legs scraping harshly across the marble floor. It screeched like an insult. She slid a few inches closer toward the bench. Deliberately. Her posture wasn't just disrespectful, it was defiant. A quiet, smug rebellion, as if to say, "You're not above me. You're not even beside me." The room felt colder. Then came the voice from the prosecution table, calm, clear, laced with smugness. Some people can't handle uniformed authority. It was Mark Hensley again. The white prosecutor leaned back, arms crossed like he'd just played a winning card. A few jurors chuckled, just enough for Valerie to smirk. The jab wasn't aimed at a defendant. It wasn't about law. It was personal, aimed straight at Monroe. For a moment, even this court reporter hesitated, unsure if she should transcribe that remark. Still seated, Judge Monroe finally lifted her eyes. She didn't scold, didn't demand order. She just looked at them, Valerie and Hensley, with a quietness that felt like a verdict. Then, in a voice so calm it almost sounded like kindness, she said, "You're right." Hensley's brows twitched. Valerie tilted her head, confused. Monroe continued, "Some people can't handle uniformed authority, especially when that uniform comes without the discipline to match it." The smirks faded, just a little, but she wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to anchor the moment. "You wear the badge," she said, "but not the burden. You wear the uniform," she added, "but forget who wrote the law it's supposed to protect." Then softer and sharper, "Power doesn't come from fabric or metal, officer. It comes from restraint." The room stilled. Even the jurors who had chuckled now sat straighter. Valerie opened her mouth and closed it again. The shift was subtle, but real. From the back row, someone murmured, "She just cleaned that whole table," without raising her voice. But Monroe didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. Instead, she turned back to her notes, flipped a page, and simply said, "Let the record reflect. Officer Quinn has refused to clarify her previous statement. The court will proceed." Like nothing happened, but everything had. At that moment, in the eyes of the room, she wasn't just a judge. She was a storm inside silence. Yet even in that moment of control, there was something else. A flicker behind Monroe's expression. Something almost weary. Because it's one thing to be underestimated by strangers. It's another to be challenged by a system that never believed you belonged on that bench to begin with. And for a brief second, Monroe's fingers lingered on her pen, not to write, but as if she were grounding herself, reminding herself who she was, who she'd fought to become. But she didn't say it. She didn't have to. Because somewhere deep in her silence, the tide was already turning. And Officer Quinn, for all her swagger, had no idea she was standing in it. The courtroom had settled into a quiet tension. Judge Monroe sat tall, flipping through her binder, as if the sting from Valerie's remarks hadn't left a mark. But those who'd been watching closely could feel it not in Monroe's voice, but in the way her fingers lingered a little longer on each page. Outside the courtroom, something else was stirring. Tracy Bennett, the senior courtroom clerk, walked briskly down the hallway with a stack of case files. As she passed the small witness waiting room, she slowed. Someone was speaking inside, loud enough for the words to slip through the crack in the door. It was Officer Valerie Quinn. Again. "This black woman actually thinks she runs this damn courtroom," Valerie said with a harsh laugh. "Like she's Queen Monroe or something." There was a beat of silence. Then Valerie added, smug and unfiltered, "She acts like she owns the whole system. Wait till we're done with her." Tracy didn't move, didn't breathe. The words burned through her, not because they were shocking, but because they weren't. They were familiar. Too familiar. And they came from someone in uniform. When the voice inside faded, Tracy stepped away. Calmly. Quietly. But her heart was pounding. Back at her desk, she tried to refocus, but Valerie's voice echoed in her head. Wait till we're done with her. Something wasn't right. Tracy had worked under many judges, some soft, some harsh. But Monroe, she was different. Balanced. Reserved. Respected. And she'd never not once retaliated, not even when disrespected. So why the venom? Curious, Tracy typed Celeste J. Monroe into the court's internal directory. Basic info came up: judicial appointment, prior circuit court law school credentials. But nothing that explained this level of hostility. She opened a private browser window and began digging deeper. And that's when the picture changed. Professor Celeste Monroe, former Harvard Law faculty, expert in constitutional law and civil rights, policy advisor to the Department of Justice, lead contributor to federal police conduct reforms post-Rodney King, keynote speaker at the National Symposium on Law and Public Accountability. Tracy blinked. There were photos, one of Monroe standing beside members of Congress in the 90s, another of her holding a report titled The People vs. Power: Rethinking Policing in America. Another link, a recording of her 2002 speech titled The Weight of the Robe, where Monroe spoke about earning her place in a system that was never built for her. Tracy leaned back in her chair, stunned. The woman they just mocked didn't just enforce the law. She had shaped it, taught it, fought for it. She didn't say a word to anyone, Instead, she printed 3 documents: Monroe's DOJ biography, a news clipping from 1994 with the headline "Harvard Scholar to Lead Reform Team," and a transcript excerpt from Monroe's Senate testimony on police brutality. She placed them in a plain envelope, no name, no note. Then she waited. When court resumed after recess, Tracy slipped to the back row just long enough to pass the envelope to a man with a quiet face and a reporter's eyes. David Chen, independent journalist, local courthouse regular. He rarely asked questions, but he never missed the answers. She dropped the envelope under his notebook as she passed. No words, no eye contact, just a gesture as quiet as it was urgent. David looked down, read the heading, then looked up slowly toward the bench where Monroe was seated with her usual calm. His fingers tightened on the envelope, and without a sound he opened his laptop and began to write. Because this wasn't just a courtroom anymore. This was the front line of something bigger. And the woman in the robe, she wasn't just defending the law. She was the law, and someone had finally remembered. The air was thick. Even the dust motes in the courtroom seemed to freeze in midair, suspended in the tension that had quietly taken root since morning. Judge Monroe sat with her hands folded, eyes calmly scanning the next exhibit. Valerie Quinn, back on the witness stand, had been fidgeting no longer with swagger, but with irritation. The room wasn't laughing anymore. The jury had grown still. Eyes lingered on Monroe. The kind of eyes that weren't just watching. They were weighing, and Valerie hated it, so she decided to provoke. When Monroe asked her to answer the question for the 3rd time, Valerie leaned forward with a sigh, rolled her eyes, and said loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear, "Your Honor, I don't take orders from women like you." The gasp wasn't audible this time. It was internal, heavy, collective. Even the bailiff flinched. It wasn't just disrespect. It wasn't just racial. It was both and more. It was intended. Monroe looked up, slowly, her gaze calm and piercing, locked onto Valerie's, and for the first time since the trial began, she spoke without restraint. Her voice was even, unshaken, yet it struck the room like a slow-moving thunderclap. "May I remind you, I helped write the laws you're quoting and trained your chief's boss." Silence. Pure absolute silence. You could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Valerie blinked twice. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked toward the prosecutor's table, hoping for some unspoken rescue. But even Mark Hensley's frozen eyes narrowed, unsure whether to step in or stay still. Across the room, a little girl no older than 8 tugged her father's jacket. She didn't shout, she whispered, "But why do I feel scared for that cop now?" Her father didn't answer. He couldn't. Because what just happened wasn't a speech. It wasn't an outburst. It was a warning spoken with the weight of legacy. Judge Monroe didn't gloat, didn't break her stare. She turned a page. Then just as smoothly, she addressed the court reporter. "Let the record reflect the witness has refused to answer the question for the 3rd time. The court will note the nature of her response." That was it. But that was enough. People in the gallery sat straighter. The jurors leaned forward, not to hear but to witness. Even the courtroom guards shifted their stance, their expressions no longer neutral, because now the illusion was broken. The judge they thought they could mock wasn't just a woman in a robe. She was a builder of the system, a keeper of its memory, and a mirror for everyone in that room to see themselves in. And what it showed wasn't pretty. Valerie sat back, rattled. She didn't understand everything Monroe had said, but she understood enough. She'd just crossed a line she didn't even know existed. And now she had to sit in it. For the next hour, Monroe asked questions with surgical precision. No need for theatrics, no raised voice. But every question was a chisel, and Valerie was crumbling. By the time Monroe recessed the court for lunch, the tone in the room had changed completely. The jury no longer looked at Monroe with skepticism. They looked at her with reverence. And Valerie? No one looked at her at all. As Monroe exited through the private door, her robe swaying quietly, David Chen closed his notebook. He'd stopped taking notes halfway through. He already knew what the headline would be. And it wouldn't be about the case. It would be about her. When the court reconvened after lunch, something had shifted. Gone was the performative confidence from Valerie Quinn. Gone was the smirking calm from Ada Mark Hensley. Even the jurors walked back into the room a little slower, as if aware they were now part of something bigger than a civil hearing. Judge Monroe entered in silence. She sat, adjusted her robe, and spoke with calm precision. "Before we proceed, the court will address an urgent procedural matter." The gallery went still. Monroe reached for a manila folder beside her gavel. She opened it slowly, deliberately, the kind of slowness that means you already lost before it began. This court has reviewed supplemental documentation submitted during recess, she said, her voice steady but firm. It includes 3 internal reports involving Officer Valerie Quinn, all related to prior misconduct during arrests involving excessive force and verbal abuse. Murmurs in the gallery. Valerie stiffened. 2 of these complaints, Monroe continued, were dismissed without public record. The third was closed with no formal explanation. She paused, letting the words sink in. Then she looked directly at Valerie, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve that cut deeper than any shouting ever could. The court is forwarding these findings along with today's conduct to the State Ethics Committee for review. Effective immediately, Officer Quinn is required to appear before the board within 10 business days. Valerie's jaw dropped. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Mark Hensley jumped in. Your Honor. With all due respect, these matters fall outside the scope of this trial. Monroe cut him off, not with a raised hand, not with a gavel, just with words cold, clear, and irreversible. You have no standing here, Mr. Hensley. He froze. She continued. This courtroom is not a training ground for power games. This is a court of justice, not a boot camp for unchecked authority. Gasps. Pure. Raw. From both sides of the room. Even the stenographer glanced up, unsure whether to keep typing or simply absorb the moment. Valerie looked toward the back of the courtroom, eyes darting, but no help was coming. Her badge couldn't protect her from this. Neither could Hensley. Because this wasn't politics. This wasn't about winning or saving face. This was accountability delivered with surgical calm. Monroe didn't flinch. Let the record reflect. She said that this action is separate from the trial. The referral stands. Officer Quinn's conduct, past and present, will be reviewed under the full weight of state oversight. Her voice didn't rise, but the room felt heavier. Like gravity had just doubled. In the back row, David Chen slowly closed his laptop. He'd stopped typing again. Some things needed to be felt, not recorded. He looked at Tracy, the clerk, who was now standing a little taller behind her desk, and he knew this was that moment. The moment where a story stops being personal and becomes national. Monroe turned the page in her binder, never once glancing back at Valerie. We will now proceed with cross-examination, she said simply. No drama, no theatrics, just justice wrapped in restraint. As the bailiff called the next witness, Valerie remained seated, her skin pale under courtroom lights. She had walked into this trial thinking Monroe was just another judge. She now knew too late that she had stood in front of a woman who didn't just understand the system. She had survived it, outlasted it, and now was quietly fixing it. The little girl in the front row tugged her father's sleeve again. "Daddy," she whispered, "that lady in the robe, she's not scared of anyone, is she?" Her father didn't speak right away. Then finally he whispered, "No, baby, they're scared of her." The courtroom had moved on, but outside, the world had just begun to watch. It started with a single video, shaky, grainy, filmed from a low angle. No one knew at first where it came from. But by the time it reached 200,000 views, someone traced the upload an anonymous TikTok account with the username Stillness Wins. The clip was only 22 seconds. It opened with Officer Valerie Quinn, uniform, tight stance, cocky, cutting off Judge Monroe mid-sentence. "You don't tell me how to do my job," she snapped, voice sharp and aggressive. Then came the moment that made everyone stop scrolling. She shoved her chair backward, loud, disrespectful, deliberate. Monroe didn't react. She didn't blink. She simply said, "You wear the badge, but not the burden." The video froze right there, on Monroe's calm face. Underneath, someone added a caption. "When power disrespected dignity, dignity stayed still," and won. By the time the news caught on, the video had 6.4 million views. What no one expected, what no media outlet predicted, was who had filmed it. Her name was Lily, 8 years old. Daughter of Marcus Daniels, a former public defender who had brought her to court that day because school was out and he couldn't find a sitter. She'd sat quietly in the front row watching everything. Her tiny fingers had held a second-hand iPhone under the bench rail. No one noticed, not even her dad, until she showed him that night at dinner. "Daddy, I recorded something. Is it okay?" He watched once, then again, and the next morning he uploaded it. Not for fame, not for clicks, but because for the first time his daughter had asked what justice looked like, and then showed him. Now it was everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, local news, activist blogs, Reddit. clips spliced with audio overlays. This is what composure looks like. Celebrities reposted it. Churches played it during sermons. One pastor in Atlanta opened his service with the line, "There's a kind of power that doesn't shout." That's what she had. Meanwhile, Officer Valerie Quinn was drowning. Her name trended on every platform, not in admiration, but in anger. Old footage surfaced. Traffic stops, aggressive language, body cam clips with muted audio, whispers of patterns now shouted as proof. And then the ethics board confirmed the summons. The internal affairs report previously sealed was leaked. Headlines screamed, "3 strikes, no accountability. The officer who challenged a judge and lost. Why the system protected her." Until the internet didn't. Inside the courthouse, Monroe remained silent. She issued no statement, no press release. She didn't even acknowledge the video. But her courtroom changed. Every seat was filled. Law students sat on the floor. Retired judges stood along the back wall. Because now the quietest woman in the room had become the loudest story in the country. In the judges' chambers, Tracy Bennett stood by the door holding a fresh stack of letters. Handwritten ones, typed ones, some from strangers, some from women who had once been silenced in rooms like this. On top was one from a retired sergeant in Ohio. It read, "I wore the uniform for 27 years, but I never saw someone wear authority like you." Monroe didn't smile. She just placed the letter in her desk drawer next to a folded piece of paper from 1994. The draft of a policy she wrote back when no one thought a black woman would ever sit where she was now. And outside her window across the city, people were beginning to believe silence was no longer weakness. It was strategy, and sometimes it was revolution. The marble steps of the courthouse had never seen flowers before. But that Monday morning, as the city woke to headlines screaming, "Judge Monroe speaks without speaking," they were everywhere. Sunflowers, white lilies, handwritten notes taped to candles. Some spelled out a message in capital letters, "Our judge, our voice." It had started with one bouquet laid gently at dawn by a woman in scrubs. Within hours, there were dozens. By midday, the press had arrived. By afternoon, Congressman Elijah Moore, a longtime advocate for judicial equity, stood on those same steps and addressed a crowd of hundreds. This is not just about one judge. This is about every citizen who has ever been silenced in the name of order. And it is time we investigate those who hide behind badges to abuse the very laws they swore to uphold. Applause erupted. He raised a folder. "This morning, I filed a formal motion calling for a congressional review of the Riverhaven Police Department's internal affairs procedures." A reporter shouted, "Is this because of Officer Valerie Quinn?" He paused, then answered with clarity, "This is because of what we saw, and more importantly, because of what we allowed for too long." Inside the courthouse, the tone had shifted again. There were whispers in the hallway, reporters in the gallery, lawyers holding back emotion, watching every move Monroe made, not as critics, but as students. Valerie Quinn, she was nowhere to be seen. That same morning, the police commissioner released a brief, curt statement. "Officer Valerie Quinn has been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation into past and current conduct. Her clearance has been revoked." But it didn't stop there. Another headline broke within the hour. Ada Mark Hensley called to testify over alleged bias mishandling of civil case. For years, Hensley had operated with unchecked influence, but now his voice was finally being questioned, not because Monroe demanded it, but because millions of strangers did. In the judge's chambers, Tracy opened a letter and chuckled softly. "Judge, you might want to see this," she said. Monroe looked up from her docket. Tracy handed over a small photograph, grainy, printed from someone's phone. It showed a group of young girls standing on the courthouse steps holding hand-drawn signs. One read, "Strong is quiet." Another simply said Monroe 2028. Monroe allowed herself a single breath of amusement. "Let's just finish this case first," she said. But Tracy noticed it the smallest smile. Later that day, a journalist from PBS requested a brief interview. Monroe declined, as expected. But the request letter had included a quote from a viewer in Oklahoma. "I've never seen someone so silent become a national conversation. She reminded me justice doesn't have to scream. It just has to stand." That night, across the city, murals began appearing. One wall near Jefferson Avenue now bore an outline of Monroe's face in grayscale with the caption, "She didn't raise her voice. We raised ours." And in homes across the country, families watched the viral clip again, but this time with new eyes. They no longer saw a judge and a cop. They saw a line that had finally been drawn, and a society finally ready to choose a side. The press room inside the courthouse had never been this full. Cameras were stacked shoulder to shoulder. Reporters lined the walls. Behind the podium, a backdrop of the state seal hung high, but it was the empty microphone stand that held every eye. People weren't there to hear a press conference. They were there to witness a moment. And then she walked in. Judge Celeste Monroe, robed, composed, quiet. No entourage, no introduction, just her. She stepped behind the podium and looked over the crowd. The chatter died instantly. Even the camera shutters slowed. She adjusted the mic slightly, took a breath, and then in the same calm voice that had stilled courtrooms and silenced disrespect, she said, "To every little girl watching, dignity doesn't need to yell. It just needs to stand." That was it. 7 seconds. One sentence. And the room stood. No questions. No follow-ups. Just the sound of people rising to their feet one by one as if pulled by something deeper than applause. Hands came together. Not in frenzy, but in recognition. Some clapped slowly. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Some simply stood. Still. Judge Monroe gave a soft nod, not of thanks but of understanding. Then she turned, walked off the stage, and exited through the side door. No wave, no cameras, no quote for the headlines. Just her. Back in the hallway, Tracy Bennett waited quietly with the elevator open. She didn't speak, just held the door. As Monroe stepped in, Tracy whispered, "You said it all." Monroe didn't answer. She didn't need to. That night, news stations across the country looped the clip. Again and again. Some added music, some added subtitles, but most didn't need to. Because that one sentence, 7 seconds, had become something more than a quote. It became a compass. Children wrote it on school posters. Churches painted it on banners. One woman in Chicago tattooed it on her forearm just above a scar from her arrest 5 years prior. And somewhere in a small home in Alabama, a little girl named Lily, the one who had once filmed from beneath a courtroom bench, stood in her bedroom mirror reciting the words to herself. Dignity doesn't need to yell, it just needs to stand. Because in a world full of noise, she had watched someone change everything by saying almost nothing. It was a Saturday morning. The courthouse was closed. The halls were silent. But inside the main atrium, something rare was unfolding. A ladder, a frame, and a little girl holding a picture with both hands. Lily Daniels, age 8, stood beside her father. She wore her Sunday shoes even though it wasn't church. In her hands was the painting she'd been working on for days, colors pressed into paper with the kind of care only a child could give. The image was bold but soft. At the center stood Judge Monroe, tall and calm in her black robe. Behind her, sunlight spilled like dawn, and above, instead of wings, open law books arched out behind her shoulders, pages fanned like feathers. Words floated gently across the top. She didn't shout, but the world heard her. The building manager adjusted the frame on the wall right beneath the courthouse seal. Tracy Bennett stepped back and wiped her eyes. "She should see this," Tracy whispered. "She already has," Lily's dad replied, smiling softly. Then, as if realizing the weight of his words, he added, "She used to want to be a cop. Now she wants to be a judge." Outside, life went on. Traffic moved. People passed by the courthouse like they always had. But inside that building, in that hall, hung a picture no one could walk past without pausing. Visitors stopped and stared. Judges came and stood silently in front of it, briefcases still in hand. Law students took photos. And once a week, a janitor would polish the frame and whisper under his breath, "About time someone showed them what real justice looks like." As for Monroe, she never said anything about the painting, never posted, never posed with it. But one morning before court opened, she arrived earlier than usual. She stood in front of it for a moment, hands clasped, head slightly tilted. And then, as Tracy passed behind her with a docket in hand, Monroe said quietly, "Put that child's name on the plaque." Tracy paused. "Lily." Monroe nodded. "Every legacy needs a witness, and every witness deserves to remember that they mattered." The plaque now reads, "Artwork by Lily Daniels, age 8. In honor of dignity that stood tall and never shouted." Years later, long after courtrooms changed and names faded from headlines, that picture still hung, unmoved, unfaded, because sometimes the loudest impact comes from the quietest voice. If this story moved you, let it live beyond the screen, because sometimes the strongest voice is the one that never needed to shout. If Judge Monroe's quiet stand inspired you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mack's Stories for more powerful, true-to-life narratives. Your support keeps these stories alive and gives us the strength to keep telling them. We're Mr. Mack's Stories, where silence speaks.